when I walked in this morning and they were rehearsing. When I came up from 8:30, they were rehearsing, and I wasn't sure who was leading. If Bill was leading or if Jonathan was leading or John was leading. They were just trying to keep up with one another, I think. And for as much as some of you had these looks on your face, what you couldn't see that Reverend Ryan and I could see when Jonathan was playing the offering was a whole bunch of our kids all looking at their adult going, "Is he playing Frozen?" "Yes, he's playing Frozen." And then they were like, "He's playing Frozen." They were really excited. Yes, he was really playing Let It Go. Well, as we enter into this second week of our journey through the book of Philippians, it's a letter, really, a letter from Paul to the church in Philippi. And I don't know if I've said this to you before, but I have a real love-hate relationship with Paul. And today, I'm not sure which end of that spectrum I'm really on. You see, last week with the first 11 verses of this book, I love them. They're fabulous. They get put on greeting cards and things. They're so good. And then you get to the second chapter of Paul, and it's very famous, and people love to quote it, and it's great. And we just skip right over these little verses. And honestly, I think I had skipped over them a whole lot. I'm not sure I had ever really dug into them the way I had this week. And I realize why we so often skip over them. You see, Paul is writing this little letter. He's writing from prison. And he's so dang joyful about everything. He's so undeterred about being in prison, and he's so willing to turn the page and figure out how he can make this a good thing for Jesus' message. And then there was this phrase that kept resonating for me this week. I think we have it on a slide. "It is my expectation and hope that I won't be put to shame in anything. Rather, I hope with daring courage that Christ's greatness will be seen in my body, now as always, whether I live or die." And the reality of it is, for most of us, we're not there. Most of us, even if we have ended up in prison, we tend not to do a very good job of finding the silver lining for it. But this week, as I was doing my study, I was really trying to figure out how to make this passage a little more doable for me. And as I kept reading, and especially with regard to this passage, each scholar, each preacher I read talked about this contrast that we see here between shame and courage. Now, some translators translate courage into boldness. And as I was reading, as disciples, preachers do, I found my little book on Philippians by the great disciple Saint Fred Craddock. Fred Craddock says that in this little passage, Paul is trying to get his friends to live their faith out in the open. They are to live a public faith. Paul is challenging his community to live unashamed of their commitment to the gospel. And he's trying to use his imprisonment to inspire them to that commitment. Now, maybe Fred Craddock's little phrase of coming out into the open really resonated with me this week because I was reading it on Wednesday. And for those of you who don't know, Wednesday was National Coming Out Day. which is a really important day for those of us who are allies of our LGBTQ friends or who identify with the LGBTQ community. And so living out in the open on National Coming Out Day made, a little sense to me. I thought Paul here is challenging his friends not to live in the closet, but to come out and not be afraid. And this morning I want to talk to us a little bit about what that might mean for some of us. It seems that our commitment to saying, I'm in, as we are trying to do during this commitment campaign, it's nice to keep the I'm in here within the confines of our worship service or within the walls of our building or the safe space of our well-churched friends. And yet we hear Paul say to us, no matter what the consequences are, I'm going to be true to myself and to my understanding of the gospel. And to be true to living a life of faith out in the open, out of my closet of fear and shame. A life worthy, he says, of the gospel of Christ. And I was thinking last week, how many of us are closeted Christians? Or even closeted churchgoers? Living in the closet, not fully out in the open. I mentioned it to Levon, our business administrator, this week. And he says to me, I don't know what you mean by closeted Christians. And I gave him an example that a member of our church had given me. Some of you were here and probably received one of our signs that says, hate has no home here. Our Justice and Mercy team worked to distribute those to our congregations, and many of us still have them in our yards or in our windows. Hate has no home here. And a neighbor, had come over and said, hey, I really love your sign. Where did you get that? And she says, I got it at church. And they said, at church? She goes, yeah, our pastors and, our justice committee handed those out for us to put in the yard. And they said, yeah, I understood. I didn't have any idea you went to church. Now, this isn't because that person isn't a good person and a great neighbor. They just never had a conversation in all the years they'd lived next door to one another about going to church. We tend to use, the phrase, well, actions speak louder than words. Well, sometimes words still matter, right? Sometimes we actually have to say that our good actions and our justice work is grounded in the gospel to which we make a commitment to each and every week when we show up here, at least some commitment in some small way. So after I had blabbered on and on, Levon said, still sitting across the desk being patient with my carrying on as he always does. He said, yeah. We tend not to talk about that very much. Politics and religion. I said, yeah, how's that working out for us? Living our faith out loud, outside of our closets of fear and shame or whatever else keeps us in our closets. I think one of the closets that I sometimes live in is, some of my clergy colleagues, my Protestant clergy colleagues, are now wearing clergy collars. You know what I mean when I say clergy, like a Roman Catholic priest might wear? Especially my female colleagues, many of Reverend Suzanne and I's female clergy colleagues I see on Facebook wearing these out in public in an attempt to really be clear about living their faith and their calling out in the open for all to see. And I'm still not sure that the clergy collar thing feels really authentic to me. I'm not sure I'll ever be there, but it does draw to my attention how often I have heard somebody say to me, I had no idea you were a minister. Now, there's probably lots of reasons for that. My lack of sensible shoes may well be one of them. But that should be a problem for me. That people don't know that I'm a clergy woman. And I wonder if it bothers you that people might not realize, people who might actually be your neighbors or friends or close to you, don't know what you do between 10:30 and 11:30 on a Sunday morning. And as I think about our commitment campaign that we are talking about all month long, this is one of those places, like I said last week, this is not just about money. And because Tom Crenshaw is listening somewhere, our treasurer, it is sort of about the money, but it's not just about the money. Our offerings and our pledges are only one way that we show our commitment, as Reverend Ryan said in his offering moment. And this week, and in this time in the political sphere and in the public conversation, I think it may be equally important for us to make our commitments to being freed from our closets, from the imprisonment of the gospel. One of the Bibles I was reading this week, they have the little headings in the Bible, right? If you have a Bible and you read it, there are these little headings at the top. So in case there's something there, to warn you against something that might be dangerous for you. And it says, they can't imprison the gospel. And they're talking about in this, they can't imprison the gospel, being the people that have imprisoned Paul, right? They may be able to put Paul in a prison, but you can't imprison the gospel. And I thought, wow, we may not be imprisoned, but how many times do we imprison the gospel? By keeping it locked away in a closet. Because, there must be something that inspires us to show up every Sunday. The coffee is not that great, y'all. It's really not. And Ryan doesn't even put out donuts. So there must be something. And if we keep doing this, something must inspire us. Don't we want to share that with somebody else? Don't we think that our world needs a little more inspiration? So I'm wondering how we might, with our lack of sensible shoes, kick down the doors of our closet. And if you do wear sensible shoes, you can open it with a key or something. Kick down the closet that we are living in, imprisoning the gospel. And it doesn't have, y'all, we're not going to stand out here on a street corner with pamphlet. That is not our way. We might let Bill stand out there and sing or something, but, beyond that. If you do Facebook, you might share the anthem this morning when Kay gets it up this week. And I don't know that I would recommend this, but you might share the sermon. I'm just saying. Maybe not. We had a great Jazz Vespers last week, and we're going to have another one this week. And not only will there be Jazz Vespers, there will be pie afterwards. So if you can't invite someone to Jazz Vespers, invite them for pie, because if they don't love pie, how are you friends with them? Seriously. Or kicking down the door of actually letting our neighbor know that, hey, we go to church. You want to go? I'll buy brunch. Because they don't have donuts. And I know that's scary for many of us. And yet Paul encourages us still today, just as he encouraged those early Christians so many years ago, not to be afraid, but to speak with boldness. To be inspired to live a life worthy of the gospel. And Paul knows very clearly, very intimately, that there are real consequences. He talks about Jesus being crucified. He talked about his own imprisonment. So really, what's the worst that could happen to us? I'll tell you. And this really isn't the worst that could happen to us, but it's a real example, at least from a preacher colleague, of what happens when churches decide to come out of their closets. Now, coming out of the closet for Word of Life Christian Church in St. Joe, this is me saying coming out of a closet. Brian Zan is the founding pastor of Word of Life Church in St. Joe. For those of you who live in Johnson County, St. Joe is north of the airport. Okay? I know that's like another world for you. So north of the airport, St. Joe. And for St. Joe, Word of Life was a megachurch, is a megachurch. Brian started that church at like 19, 20 years old, and congregation that was wildly successful for many, many years. But one day, and this is a public story, there was a big article about it just this week in a Baptist magazine that I happened to be reading. There was something about himself and his preaching and about his congregation, and he doesn't say that they were living in a closet, but they were living in what he calls, quote, a shallowness and an easy, cheesy, cotton candy Christianity. I like that. I don't like the easy, cheesy, cotton candy Christianity, but I like his language for it. That's how he described what he was doing. And so he began on this journey. And over the next year began to challenge his congregation in new ways. You may want to guess what happened? They lost 1,000 members in 1 year. They had 1,000 members to lose, right? I wonder what Brian might say this morning, but I wonder if he might not agree with Paul that when you get serious about living a life worthy of the gospel, a life out loud, outside of our closets, there will absolutely be consequences. As I say to my kids all the time, there are always consequences for our actions, no matter what they are. So I'm wondering this morning, as we pursue this commitment campaign of ours, what are we willing to risk to step out of our closets? How are we willing to allow Paul's example of imprisonment to inspire us? How are we allowing the gospel to inspire us? One of the things Brian did was, get serious about the letters that are in red, right? How are we being called and challenged to inspire others in new ways so that we might help to inspire the public conversation in a new and healthier and maybe even gospel-like way? And just as that church suffered, truly suffered, and grieved the loss of fellow members, in that same little Baptist paper, I was reading another article about more and more folks who are desperate to have something other than a cheesy cotton candy kind of Christianity, or as we in Kansas City might say, sort of a meat and fork kind of place. A meat and potato kind of congregation, where you not only need a knife, you need a steak knife. One woman said, I gave up on church not because we don't want to attend church, but we can't find a church to attend that's not a cotton candy kind of place. And I wonder if it's because some of us who happen to be connected and committed to a more progressive style of faith are stuck in our closets, imprisoning the gospel as we know it. And how's that working out for us, my friends? So as we go through this campaign of examining and praying about and exploring our own commitments to the gospel and living a life worthy of it. And as each week in your news bulletin you see these "I'm in" statements from some of our church members, I'm working too on how I'm going to be more in. But this morning, maybe I'm wrong about that. Maybe I need to be challenging myself and maybe challenging all of us, not to say I'm in, but I'm out. I'm out of my closet, or maybe I'm trying to be. Out of my closet a little more, out of my security net a little more. Living a life out loud, worthy of the gospel of Jesus. I'm out. Or at least I'm trying to be. And I want to invite you to be out with me. May it be so. May it be so for us. Amen.